Hello and welcome to the 2024 Economic Summit, brought to you by Coldwell Banker Realty and Guaranteed Rate Affinity. We are proud to have so many of you watching from across the country today. We are coming to you from the beautiful mile-high city of Denver, Colorado. And here's a look right now at our Front Range Rocky Mountains. My name is Lane Lyon. I am a managing real estate broker in Denver and longtime television journalist, so I'm excited to be your host today for this informational program. You know, as we all know, the real estate market has been a wild ride in recent years with unprecedented shifts from soaring prices, unexpected fluctuations. It's been a roller coaster of sort for buyers, sellers, and for real estate industry professionals. However, through it all, we have seen some incredible resilience, paving the way for new opportunities and growth. So the big question, what's in store for 2024? Well, today we have some answers and some insight into the economic landscape. I'm pleased to introduce our chief economist, Elliot Eisenberg, who's joining us today. Can we call you Elliot?
Please do.
So many of us know you as that. Dr. Eisenberg is an internationally acclaimed economist, widely recognized, but we really appreciate the fact that you make it relevant and you make it fun too. So thank you for that. We appreciate it. Quick bio for you: BA in Economics from McGill University in Montreal, Master's and PhD in Public Administration from Syracuse. And we're excited you're with us today. By the way, I always think about you and have a nightly laugh when the brief blog shows up in my email.
Wow.
So if it is not landing in your email every day, you'll want to take note at the end of the program, jot out the information so you're not left out. So thank you again for being here. And without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's look at the data. There's a lot to talk about. So let's begin. And as Lane mentioned earlier on, the economy is doing pretty well right now. And the reason it's doing well right now is because household consumption is strong. Consumers just continue to spend money buying stuff. I think it weakens. That's my concern going forward, and we'll discuss this very soon. The second term in GDP is I, corporate investments in plant and equipment. It's beginning to waver, making me nervous. The third term in GDP is G, government spending. It's not going to be as stimulative as it was last year, and there's a distinct possibility that government closes somewhere here. You know, we'll find out about that, but you never know. Last but not least, there's exports minus imports. And that's been very strong of late and been a big help. But as I will show you, it's beginning to level off and the benefits from it are going to slow down. So we're going to be relying increasingly on C, 70% of GDP. So let's look at that right away. And what we see here, this is automobiles. I know it's an odd place to begin a presentation, but here's the point. Think of automobiles a bit like housing. We make about 1.5 million, 1.6 million new homes a year, about 16 million cars, so 10 times as many. And cars cost about a tenth as much as a house, 50,000 versus 500,000. What we see, and it's very interesting, is notice housing activity here, car sales, are going up. And this is not what you would expect. The Fed raises rates, interest-sensitive sectors of the economy weaken. That would be new home construction, new auto sales, and commercial construction. And yet they all are doing okay, well to okay, because our economy has propellant, extra energy, extra oomph, extra cash, extra wealth because of COVID. So what happened here was, well, this was COVID. No one needs a car because we're all on the verge of death. But then we all want cars because we're all moving somewhere, rural areas, bigger backyards, and so on because of COVID. And then supply chain snap. And now supply chains have been improving. So despite the fact that rates are going up, car sales are very good. This is one of the reasons our economy is doing as well as it is and is so resilient. We also see it here. Look at this. If we ignore COVID, just go like that and extrapolate what would have been had there been no COVID, it's as if COVID never happened. Consumer spending remains strong. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to begin to weaken. And what's keeping it up is the key question. And here's some answers. First, look at savings rates. They're very, very low. Before COVID, they were, ballpark 7%. Now they're more like 3.5%. So they've fallen by 50%. They can't get much lower. This decline in savings rates has helped propel the economy forward. Similarly, credit card use in blue has gone up. Moreover, credit card costs keep rising. Last I checked a couple days ago, they were 21.5% was the average. So we're borrowing more at a higher rate. Nothing here is terribly awful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the world's going to come to an end. It's not. But I'm saying this is what's helping propel our economy forward. And unemployment's 3.8, 3.7% low. If it gets higher, things get a little worse. So we're doing okay, but we're getting an assist from credit cards and reduced savings, not a long-term solution, if you will, right? And why is this happening? It's happening because we're not earning enough to keep up with inflation. That's the problem. So for 2 years, the better part of 2 years, when the blue line is below the x-axis, we're not making enough to cover the cost of inflation. We're actually losing income. And that's why we're relying on credit cards and reduced savings and so on. But there's something else, another piece of magical sauce, if you will, that's keeping us going. I'm going to come back to the slide in a second. And it's this. This is excess COVID savings. So during COVID, we didn't travel. We didn't go anywhere. We couldn't do so many things. We could buy things, but we couldn't do anything experiential. So we ended up accumulating money that would have otherwise been spent. But now we're running that money down. And, end of Q1, early Q2 of this year, we'll be out of this excess COVID savings. So between the credit card use, reduced savings, and excess COVID savings, that's kept propelling our economy forward. This is important because of this. Let's go back one slide and look at this here. Before COVID, earned income was growing at this rate, at this pace. Then comes Stimmy Check 1, Stimmy Check 2, Stimmy Check 3. Fine, great, wonderful. Pace is essentially continuing. But then inflation starts to take off in middle of 21 through 22. It averaged that year 9.1%. Income wasn't keeping up. Incomes decline, and we end up here. Now income's going back up again. But we're at a much lower level. Had this trajectory continued, we'd be $1 trillion higher than we are. So the reason we're able to make that up is because of excess COVID savings, credit card use, and reduced savings. We need something to help keep this sustained. What we need to keep it going is job growth and real income growth. Hopefully it happens, but who knows? That's the big $1 million question going forward. Now, there's a lot of good news happening in the economy too, and we know that inflation's falling dramatically. And the more inflation continues to fall, the faster the Fed lowers rates. Very important. So let's look at the good news. First, inventories. This is retailers' inventory to sales ratios, the most important thing. All the other stuff is designed to get the stuff onto the shelves so that you can walk in and buy a box of Kleenex or whatever it is. And you can see it was very low here. That began to generate very high levels of inflation. And as inventory levels increased, inflationary pressures on goods declined. Now, on top of that, China's exporting stuff to us. They have deflation in China. That's causing goods prices to actually decline, real mention decline. And you can see inventories now, they're not as high as they were before COVID. That was the low before COVID. They're still a little lower, but we're making progress. Of late, not going anywhere. Firms aren't saying, oh, let's invest more in inventory. They're not, because the cost of carrying inventory is high. And the fear of a recession's coming. And I think that we do get a recession. That's important. But there are a lot of caveats, and we'll get there as we discuss it. But let me touch on one of them right now. If the concern is we're going to have a recession versus a soft landing, hard landing versus soft landing, don't think of it in terms of these two extremes. Think of the hard landing, a recession, maybe somewhere here. And a soft landing is somewhere here. It won't be a terrible recession because there's nothing fundamentally wrong with our economy. The Fed's raising rates because inflation's too high, inflation falls, the Fed lowers rates. It's a garden variety recession. Therefore, we go from here to here. On the other hand, rates have risen quite a lot, and that munches economic growth. It saps economic growth slowly. So we're not going to have a tremendous economy in 24, but if we avoid a recession, it'll be there. So don't think of this, think of this. That's number one. Number two, and this is critically important, the real estate economy has already suffered a recession. Existing home sales, which we'll discuss later, have fallen precipitously from over 6 million a year annualized, seasonally adjusted, and so on, down to under 4. Whether we have a hard landing here or a soft landing there, interest rates come down. That will benefit the housing industry. So in terms of the housing sector itself and existing home sales, this talk of recession or not really isn't all that important. So don't perseverate and don't really concern yourself with it. All right, we'll discuss other factors about the economy or dimensions of it. Other pieces of good news are this. The global supply chain's in pretty good shape. During COVID, it got very expensive to do all kinds of things because there weren't enough trucks. There weren't enough ships. There weren't enough shipping containers, and so there weren't enough truck drivers. There weren't enough new trucks to buy, and so on. That problem has gone away essentially. So the cost of transportation, the cost of goods has actually declined, reducing inflation. Very helpful. The next thing we know is household wealth. This goes through Q3, but we know in Q4 home prices continued to rise, and the stock market did very well in Q4. So households are feeling a little more buoyant, a little wealthier. They'll spend a little more money. That can help consumer spending as well. So good stock market performance, we'll see if it continues or not. Decent labor market performance, income growth exceeding inflation, and maybe we skirt the recession. I think it's entirely possible. I don't think it's not my base case, but it's also a distinct possibility out there. It's not something I poo-poo and totally ignore either. Important to remember that. The other piece of good news, there's lots, but here's another one. Oil prices. They're largely going nowhere. This was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that caused short-term pain in oil and energy markets. But since then, pretty much nothing is going on. Even though the Saudis have cut production, Russia's cut production, and so on, China's growth has been a little bit reduced, and the U.S. is producing more oil. Brazil's producing more oil. Similarly, Guyana is producing more oil. They are suddenly becoming an oil superpower on the way to producing 1 million barrels a day. They're now at about 400,000, ramping up. So global oil markets are well supplied. There's no real problem there. No inflation coming in that direction. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the big helps our economies enjoyed is trade. If we look at this graph prior to COVID, the trade deficit, so that's imports and that's exports, that gap is here in red. Before COVID, it was running at roughly negative $50 billion a month. During COVID, it got very bad very quickly and bottomed out at negative $100 billion. So the monthly trade deficit doubled. But since then, it's been steadily improving, and now it seems to be leveling off, and that's the point. Leveling off is not going to get better, helping GDP in the short run. So this has helped, but is likely to no longer do so. It's now at about $60 billion a month, and that's likely where it's going to stay with, perturbations bouncing around. Let's now look at the other part of the economy, other parts of the economy, more larger sectors of the economy. First, the service sector. This is a big chunk of GDP, very large chunk. Think of educational services, right? You're going to school. Rent is a service that you're acquiring, and so on. Healthcare, big chunk of the economy, 18, 20% of GDP. It's above 50, which is neutral. Above 50, you're growing. Below 50, you're in recession. But it's making me nervous, because if you look at the last 4 or 5 months, here, here, it's getting dangerously close to 50. Look, 1 month of 50 like we had back here, I don't care. It's one off. It's a weird thing, whatever. But if you're systematically getting closer to 50, I get nervous. Because historically, whenever services go into recession, the economy follows. So I'm paying attention to this. I'm paying attention closely. I'm not yet nervous, but I'm beginning to think about getting nervous. Let's put it that way. In addition, this is manufacturing. A much smaller percentage of GDP, maybe 9, 10% of GDP is manufacturing. And while it's been in recession now for 12 or 13 months, it's not a big enough sector of the economy to drive us into recession single-handedly. We'd need to see construction go in there. Certainly services would go in there, whatever. We'd have a recession. This alone is not enough. And it's been going up a little bit of late. So I'm a little bit more optimistic here, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic here, right? And then there's small business. This was put up by the National Federation of Independent Business. These are businesses with generally less than 10 employees, so they're very small, like, compared to Google or Microsoft or whatever. It's gone up a little bit the last month, but I would not say small business is particularly happy, right? So that's it's a little bit of a problem. And then this is a much more important measure. This is leading economic indicators put up by the Conference Board. They put out simultaneously 3 pieces of data every month when this one comes out. They put out lagging economic indicators, coincident economic indicators, and leading economic indicators. The coincident economic indicators are fine, but the leading economic indicators, as you can see, are very low. And historically, when we're at this low level, we get recessions 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8 for 8. So if you're a betting person and you're walking into Vegas, and I tell you that the roulette wheel has, rolled 12 the last 7 times in a row or 8 times in a row, I bet you're going to plunk down money on number 12. That's sort of the same thing we've got going on right here. This makes me nervous too. This also makes me nervous. This is corporate investment in equipment, capital goods, also intellectual property, ChatGPT, you get the idea, generative AI, and so on. This is not inflation adjusted. Here we're looking at inflation adjusted. It's dipping down. Look, it's not dipping down very fast. I mean, here's 65 billion, 60 billion. So it's down by a few $billion a month over the course of a year. We're talking 25 billion bucks, a tenth of a point of GDP. Not huge, but not a great harbinger either, right? So we see services getting close to neutral, manufacturing in recession, leading economic indicators are weak. Firm investment in equipment, not so hot. We looked earlier at inventories and they had sort of leveled off at 1.3. So we see firms pulling back a little bit, being a little bit less willing to take risk, if you will, right? That's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing over there. And we see banks. Banks aren't lending so much. And you say, why not? This is a feature of high rates. As rates go up, and the Fed raises interest rates deliberately to cool the economy down, the way it works is partly this way. Banks sort of look at people and say, well, I would have been willing to lend to this person when interest rates were 3 or 4%. But now that rates are 7 or 8 or whatever they are, that person's ability to repay is lower. That firm's ability to pay is lower, and therefore I'm not going to lend. This data comes from a survey of lending officers at banks. And they say, hey, are you making it easier or harder to lend? Right now, we see about 30% of banks are making it harder to lend. When that many banks are making it harder to lend, in this case for commercial and industrial loans, but you could look at it for CRE loans, you could look at it for signature loans, auto loans, home loans, credit cards, and so on. Recession, a weird quarter, and recession, 4 for 4. So the evidence begins to build up that our economy is facing these threats, right? Households that are kind of borrowing money and saving less, firms that are investing less in inventory, banks that are unwilling to lend, leading economic indicators that are weak. I mean, nothing here is terrible. That's why the recession, if we have it's not a bad one. It's not 08, 09, and so on. It's less severe. So don't sit here and go, oh my God, it's the end of the world. It's not. Just keep in mind, it's a possibility, a mild recession. That's the key. Another variable I like to look at is default rates. And you can see here, auto loan default rates are rising, as are credit card default rates. They're rising too. And I say to myself again, we've got an unemployment rate that's below 4%, yet these numbers are starting to go up and they're making me a little bit nervous. So I'm saying, not great news, not awful. That is awful, 08, 09. This is not. This is a very different economy, different place, different reason for inflation, different reason the Fed's doing what it's doing. Again, mild recession or slower growth. We're not going to have a booming economy with a soft landing or a horrible economy with a hard landing. It's not going to happen. It'll be a garden variety recession, as I mentioned earlier. And something else to look at, pardon me, here's this, loan loss reserves by banks. Now, this is small domestic banks. We're not looking at money center banks. We're not looking at Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and so on. We're looking at smaller local banks. And what they're doing is increasing their loan loss reserves because they're concerned primarily about office space and commercial property. And office space has a 20%, 19.6 vacancy rate, the highest ever in large measure because of work from home. So you might say, this is really bad news. It's not as bad as you think. Yeah, this is not terrific news, don't get me wrong. But I'm not sitting here going, oh my gosh, this is going to cause a banking collapse and a recession. It won't. It may well be, academic research has shown us that it's possible that several hundred banks, small domestic banks, will go under. This is not going to cause a recession all by itself. We are aware of the problem. The economists and the bankers and so on are aware of this. This might exacerbate the recession that we have or weaken growth. We don't have a recession, but it's an added weight that's on the shoulders of the economy. That's how to think about this. And then, of course, we've got monetary and fiscal policy. What we have here is a graph that shows us that fiscal policy last year was quite expansionary because the budget deficit grew a lot. This year it's not going to happen. It's going to be a little contractionary. And monetary policy is going to be a little bit more contractionary than last year, not a lot. You might say, why? The Fed's going to lower rates sometime in 24, and that's very likely the case. We'll discuss more about that later. But the problem is there are lags in monetary policy. So the Fed raises rates, March in 23 the first time. You don't say to yourself, oh my gosh, I better not buy that lamp I've been looking at because they're raising rates. Unless you're buying a car or buying a house or buying a building or building a building and getting a long mortgage for that, interest rates don't generally interfere every day. I mean, credit cards aside, and even there, they're not that big a portion, right? But this is going to be a drag. So the overall impact of both contractionary monetary policy in blue and fiscal policy in red, you can see last year was a mild drag on GDP of a little bit less than 1%. Here it becomes a much bigger drag of 2 or over 2%. So it's an increase of 1 full percentage point in drag from monetary and fiscal policy. Not something I'm terribly excited about for obvious reasons. And on top of that, we have student loan repayment. And this is various income levels and how difficult will it be for you to pay your student loans on top of all your other expenditures, monthly expenditures that you've got. So this is an added burden that the economy faces. And most importantly, of course, is monetary policy. And here we have a graph that shows us the history of monetary policy dating back to 1955. And what this shows us is 3 exceptions, 64, 84, and 94. Whenever the Fed raises rates, we get a recession. We got lucky those 3 times. 64 was the Vietnam War ramping up, so stimulative fiscal policy. In 84, energy prices collapsed, hurt Colorado, where I am right now, hurt Oklahoma, Texas, and so on. But outside of energy producing states, it didn't really matter. As a matter of fact, it helped because gasoline was cheaper, home heating fuel was cheaper. So we got a tax cut essentially in the form of cheap energy. And while we had high interest rates, the combination, they'll cancel each other out. We avoided a recession. And in 94, we were in the midst of the tech boom that ran from 1990 to 2000 with the NASDAQ doing nothing but go up for the better part of 10 years. So we got lucky. If you don't get lucky, you'll wind up with a recession. Now, it's entirely possible that we get lucky here. The combination of demand for autos, pent-up demand, excess COVID savings, new home construction, which we'll get to doing pretty well, the money supply, which we'll talk about soon, doing well, may give us enough propellant to keep the economy going such that it keeps going, and then the Fed lowers rates. And since we still have propellant, lower rates begin to help the economy turn around slowly. We avoid the recession. We need some luck, but it's entirely possible. Again, not my base case. Now, we've also got the inverted yield curve. And this is hurting home buyers. Because many times when rates are high, home buyers say, well, look, I'm not going to get a 30-year mortgage. I'll get a 7-year or a 5-year ARM. And the reason the 5-year ARM is cheaper is because the yield curve is upward sloping. So if you borrow for 5 years, you're here paying, I'm making up a number, 5%. If you're up here at 30 years, you're paying, I'm making up a number, 7%. But now the yield curve's actually inverted. So the savings you get from borrowing for a shorter duration are largely eliminated. And every time the yield curve goes from positively sloped to negatively sloped, like it is now, the blue squiggle goes above the red bar. And with the exception of the far left, 1966 or 65, every time the yield curve inverts, you get a recession, a recession, a recession, another recession. So 2 there, oops, a recession here, 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 and there. 8 for 8. Doesn't mean we're going to have one now, but it's highly suggestive, like leading economic indicators and so on. Now, the yield curve is looks like it's coming back down. That's arguably a good sign, but not as good as you think, because what happens often is the yield curve goes back to normal slope, normal upward sloping. The longer you borrow, the more you pay. And then the recession hits, and then the recession hits, and then the recession hits, because it takes time. The Fed raises rates. Unless you buy a car or a home or a building, you don't care about interest rates. So the rates have to stay up for a long time to impact a large enough percentage of the economy to get the recession. It takes 2 years. So this whole process of up and then down or up and then down takes several years. That's why you sometimes get the recession after the yield curve goes from positive to negative back up to positive. Seems strange, but that's the way it is. So keep this in mind. And this is important because the Fed raised rates the first time in March of 22. And right now, we're almost in March of 24. Historically speaking, it takes about 2 years to get a recession from the first rate hike. So we're now entering, I will almost say, like the red zone here, where we're near the end zone. Do we go in and get a recession or not? If we get lucky, like 64, 84, 94, we don't. But it's entirely possible that we do. The weight of the evidence, in my opinion, says yes. But you cannot discount just dumb luck. And we may well avoid it as a result. That would be great, right? And here's an example of explaining why monetary policy will be so contractionary in 24, despite the fact that the Fed is lowering rates. This shows us that the impact of monetary policy, the negative impact of monetary policy, didn't begin until the fourth quarter of 23. Even though the Fed had raised rates 8 or 9 or 10 times before that, because it takes so long to feel the impact of higher rising rates. So we're now facing the head-on impact of tighter monetary policy, even though the Fed's going to start to lower. And when the Fed lowers, it takes a long time for those lower rates to work their way through the economy as well. But that's why monetary policy is going to be contractionary in 24. Now, how long will the recession last? Let's review. I don't think it's going to be a bad recession, garden variety. And we look at history here. These two line recessions together are the Great Depression. Since the Great Depression, so right here, of all these recessions, only 3 were meaningfully long. 74, 75, Arab oil embargo. We're now the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. 81, 82, the second Paul Volcker recession, when interest rates have been going up and inflation, have been going up for such a long time, 15 years of bad monetary policy, results in Volcker raising rates to 17, 18%. It's over. Inflation's well down already now. How low it goes to 3 or 2 is the question, not whether it's 14 or 15. And here's the global financial crisis housing bust of 08-09, when asset prices were crazy high and totally out of whack. Aside of those 3, recessions are 8 months, 11 months, 8 months, 11, 6, 8. You get the idea. This will be one of those. And to give you an inkling of the severity, look, the last recession, 08-09, that one, unemployment rose from 5 to 10.5%. 5.5 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. This time, maybe it goes up, maybe by 2 percentage points. It's a very different recession that we're going to have. That's why it's not going to be here, it'll be here. Much weaker, milder, garden variety recession, right? It's important. Let's talk about the labor market now. I think it's the most important sector in the entire economy. If it does well, households feel confident and they spend. Corporations feel confident and invest and hire workers. If consumers are nervous because unemployment is going up, they stop spending, firms stop investing, and they stop hiring, and then they begin to fire the next phase, lay off workers, and then you got a recession. Let's look at the data. The data in the labor market is clearly weakening, there's no question. The question is, how much does it weaken? That's the point. So here, unemployment is going up. It hit a bottom and it's rising. Historically speaking, when it rises, like here, 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 and there, it goes up a lot and you get a gray bar, a recession. So I'm nervous. Could this go up just a little bit and then start to come down? It could. Has it happened much in the past? No, not really. There are a couple exceptions. It happened here. It got worse. We were fine. Here a little bit. I mean, it happens, but not often. So this is telling us, historically speaking, rising unemployment generally generates recession. But we could get lucky. And other indicators are okay. This one's the work week. You can see it's been pretty flat now for the better part of a year. This data is not getting worse. It's not getting better. It's not getting worse. That's okay. Now look at overtime hours. Very low. They went up most recently, but recession, 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 recession. So we're 5 for 5 here. So in these 3 pieces of data, it's interesting, and it really spans the gamut. You've got unemployment that's low, but going up, making me nervous. You've got the work week, which is flat. That's okay, at a decent level, historically speaking, fine. And you got overtime hours, which are atrocious. This gives almost everybody some data to validate their opinion. We're going to have a soft landing. We're going to have a hard landing. Let's look at some more data. This is the total hours worked in our country, the change from quarter to quarter. As you can see, the last couple quarters, it's gone nowhere. We're hiring people, but we're not increasing the total hours worked in the country. So we're hiring someone here, and we're telling somebody else over there, come in at noon on Mondays, or come in at noon every day, or whatever it is. The extra hours this new person's working, the hours this new person's working, are being fully offset by the existing labor force working a little bit less. That's not sustainable. Firms aren't going to keep hiring on one hand and then simultaneously essentially doing a little bit of micro layoffs at the other end. Something's got to give here. We'll see. If we have a soft landing, those folks who are coming in late on Mondays or whatever, they'll come back. If we have a recession, the last people hired will probably lose their job. It'll go one way or the other. I think, again, we get the recession, but it's possible we don't. I'm hopeful we don't, but again, it's not my base case. Here's another piece of weakening data. This is quits. So what percentage of the labor force is quitting their job every month? It's 2.2% are quitting their job every month. Now, it was as high as 3% at the peak of COVID. You can't see it because the red line's on top of it. But for a couple months, it was 3%. This is when COVID was bad. Senior citizens, people over 60 were afraid of getting COVID. They dropped out. Everyone was getting nervous. The government was giving us stimmy checks. So we had money. We were fearful. A lot of folks didn't work. Those who did could quit their jobs and make a lot of money because quit rates were very high, suggesting it was easy to find a job. This number's coming down. That's good news. I wonder if it has to come down more. That's the question. I'll come back to this, and here's why. This is wage growth. Wage growth now is 4.1. It was 4.1%, most recent data we have. Before COVID, right here, it was averaging about 3%. Don't look too far to the left here. This is when we were crawling out of the global financial crisis housing bust, and unemployment was 9, 8, 9%. So that's a far cry from where we are. But under normal conditions, wage growth has historically been the last, since 2016 or so, between 2.5% and 3.5%. We need this number to get back down to 3.25%, 3, somewhere around there. If it's above that, the Fed will be unable to get inflation down to 2%. We need to get this lower. Now, can this get lower without unemployment going up? If we can, we're in business. And this could happen. Let me explain. It's because of this. The labor force participation rate has been slowly, generally getting better. Last month, it went down a lot. 1 month isn't a trend. And moreover, you see here, one bad month there, and a bad month there, and a bad month there, and there, and there. So it happens from time to time. So this is not something to get nervous about. But it has been rising. If the existing population, more of the existing population works, there's more people to hire, firms don't have to offer so much money, wage pressures can decline, and employment can go up. Excellent. The other factor, another supply factor in our favor, is immigration, legal immigration. Last year, it was the highest this century. So if we have more immigration and most people who immigrate here work, and the existing labor force has a higher percentage of workers, there's an ample supply of workers firms can hire without increasing inflationary pressures, actually decreasing inflationary pressures. That would be more of the luck we're talking about here. So more labor force, more immigration, fast falling inflation, wages ahead of inflation, real wages growing, we avoid the recession. That's great. Now, let's look back to the slide I skipped. This is monthly job growth. What you see here is clearly a trend. It's down, but of late, it's kind of flattened out. Let's hope it continues to flatten out. If it flattens out somewhere around here, it's say 150,000 jobs. That's 200, 100, 150,000. There's no recession. Now, lately, the last couple of months, here, and there, we've been at or below that number. So we're still getting, and the worst 4 numbers we've had since COVID are here, and there. Moreover, these numbers generally are getting reduced. The first 11 months of 2023, 10 of 11 months were reduced. We don't have the final revisions for the December number. So I suspect that this number may well get reduced down a little bit. But so far, so good. If we stay above 150,000 jobs a month net, no recession. If we get to, say, 75, we're on the verge of no economic growth. If we get to 0, we have a recession on our hands. So the difference between a recession and no recession is 100,000 jobs a month. That's 1 million, 1.2 million a year in an economy with 160 million workers. These are very small differences. That's why it's hard to know what does the data say. If it gets weaker, the recession shows up. We'll see. I'm hopeful that this might not. Some luck comes. Inflation falls fast. The Fed cuts rates, and so on. Let's now look at inflation. You already saw a sneak preview. Do I see inflation? Yeah, I see inflation. There's inflation. It's unavoidable, right? You can't not see it. You walk in the store and the box of Cheerios now costs $4, not $3, or a gallon of milk costs $4, not $3.50, or whatever it is, right? But inflation is falling. I'm going to show you 4 or 5 measures of inflation, different ways to look at it. They're all falling, and that's the important thing. This is headline CPI. Comes out about the 10th, 11th, 12th of every month. And it says, hey, things are falling. It's going up and down a little bit, but economists don't pay much attention to the headline number. They look at the core number, red. First, it bounces much less. The difference is food and energy. Food and energy are in the headline, but not in the core. And what drives food and energy prices is essentially weather and war. The Fed's not going to rearrange U.S. monetary policy and raise or lower rates because of a war in the Middle East, for example, or a crop failure in Iowa or Saskatchewan or New South Wales, Australia, or whatever it is. Because the lower rates here or higher rates here aren't going to alter those problems. So the Fed looks through the blue to focus on the red. The red's falling nicely. That's more important than the blue. If this continues to fall, the Fed's very happy. But the Fed also wants to look at wages. Remember, I told you earlier here that wage growth is going up too much. If you're concerned about wage growth, where will wage growth show up most clearly in the economy is in the service sector. Because the service sector is primarily wages. If you want to go see a string quartet, in some nice club or something, it's hiring 4 people and some rent, or a quintet, 5 people and a bit of rent. But you get the idea. So now we're going to replace core CPI, excluding food and energy, to look at services CPI. It's about 5%. It's too high. It has to come down. Historically, you see it, about 2.5%, 3%. It's continuing to fall. It will keep falling. But will it fall? Where will it be low enough for the Fed to lower rates? That's the question. So far, we've looked at headline CPI doing pretty well, core CPI doing really nicely, service CPI high but falling very nicely. And let's wrap up with 2 more measures of CPI. This is personal consumption expenditure inflation, PCE. Different measure than CPI, but the same story. Headline in blue, more variation than the red, falling at a lower level than the red, but the red's falling nicely. The Fed focuses primarily on core PCE. So it's this red, not this red, not core CPI, but core PCE, and it's falling nicely. It's not much above 3%. When this number falls below 3, I bet the Fed starts to lower rates, and we're at 3.2. We're pretty close. So the Fed's going to lower rates in 24, unless something just awful happens and inflation goes crazy or something. They'll lower rates. So what do I think the path looks like? Last time, the Fed funds rate's now 5 3/8. The Fed last rose on July 26th. At their last meeting in December, they didn't do anything. At their next meeting in February, ends Feb 1st, they're doing nothing. The meeting after that is mid-March. They're not going to lower. The market thinks they're going to lower. They're not going to lower. This Fed has been very clear. They raised rates higher than we thought. They're now going to keep rates higher for longer than we thought. Maybe not as long as we thought 5 months ago, but longer than the market thinks. The only reason the Fed's going to start to lower very quickly is if inflation just the bottom falls out of inflation, which would be dynamite, or we have signs of recession. Either way, then they're going to start to cut rates strong. But otherwise, they're going to wait till May or June. I think May is the earliest realistic chance of the Fed lowering the Fed funds rate. And by June, I suspect strongly that they will. But again, they may not. The Fed has been a negative surprise across the board since they began raising rates in March of 22. Another reason the economy is doing surprisingly well, despite the current situation, is the money supply. We've talked about autos doing well. We've talked about pent-up demand matched with credit card use, reduced savings, and excess COVID savings. We'll talk about new home construction doing pretty well. And then there's the money supply. Right now, the money supply is shrinking quite rapidly because, remember, banks aren't lending. 33% or so of banks are saying we're making it harder to get C&I loans, CRE loans, signature loans, credit cards, autos, and so on. That alone would give us a recession like it did back here Now, this is 50 years ago. I understand it, but you get my point. But you can't look at this in isolation. You've got to look at it in conjunction with this. There was massive increase in the money supply because we were all developing our excess COVID savings. It was rising. We were getting stimmy checks. If you had a business, PPP loans, and so on and so forth. We were bringing money to banks in wheelbarrows back in late 2021, and early 22. So people could refi their house, buy a car and get a low mortgage, buy a boat and get a low mortgage, buy an airplane maybe and get a low mortgage, but you get the idea. So a lot of us have a very nice interest rate capital structure, borrowing structure in our house or business. Therefore, even though rates are high and the money supply is shrinking, it doesn't really matter. If this ends relatively soon and the money supply starts to go up because the Fed lowers rates, we can withstand this without a recession. It would be odd because again, here, and here, it fell a lot, we had a recession. So the car's doing well, money supply having done well, excess COVID savings remaining, new home construction, which we'll talk about, doing well, are keeping the economy up. It's propellant from COVID. Think about it this way. Think back to the recession of 08-09. It was a tough recession, but it came later than many people thought. Why? Because there was tons of cash out refi on houses. Because home prices in 4, 3, 4, 5, 6 were going up really nicely. People were using their house as an ATM, taking out a tremendous amount of GDP equivalent percentage for every quarter in cash out refi. This time it's excess savings and so on that are doing the same trick, delaying the possible onset of recession. And maybe, with luck, no recession. Let's now turn our attention to housing. Then we'll talk a little bit about local conditions. The housing market suffers from a lack of inventory. This is the single most important problem that faces. Yeah, high prices are a problem and high rates are a problem too. And they're intermingled here and there's causality going on here. But let's look at the data. Here's NAR data, last day of the month. Number of units available, very weak. There's no question it's low. Look historically, we rarely ever get this, barely above 1 million units. I mean, it doesn't happen. There's no homes to buy. Sure, interest rates are high. What's driving this is interest rates. Rates were low from March of 22 when COVID hit through March of 20 through March of 22. For those 2 years, rates were essentially rock bottom. About 10 million people bought a house during that time, and the other 70 million people with a house refied their mortgage. So people now have 3%, 30-year mortgages, 3.5%, 4%, 2.875, whatever it is, right? Super low mortgage. No one wakes up now and says, hey, let's buy a new house. Because the more interest rate's going to go from 3 to over 6, 6.5, whatever it is. And the house is much more expensive. People are holding back. But the reason they're not putting the house on is because the current interest rate that they pay versus the rate that they would pay if they got another house is so large, it's so yawning, people hold back. The only people who end up having to buy a house are people who have octuplets. They've died and the estate's selling the house. They have disease, they have debt, they got a new job. They're forced to sell for one reason or another. So there may not be a lot of demand for housing out there, but there's even less supply. And that's fascinating because as a result of that, home prices are rising. During COVID, the 2 years of COVID, from early 20 to early 22, home prices appreciated very rapidly because we wanted to move somewhere else, get a big backyard, have a pool, be safe, help our kids play and have a nice environment and whatever. Then interest rates start to rise in March of 22. And historically, we know that when rates rise, the housing market gets whacked. So house prices begin to sympathetically decline right off the bat. But after 7 or 8 months, we realize, this time is different. There's no inventory because we have golden handcuffs. We have a house that's with a 3% mortgage. We may want to move. We may just have had triplets, but we have a low mortgage. We're not going to move. We may have gotten a new job, but we're going to drive an hour and a half each way and keep the mortgage low. So this gap between the current rate, interest rate, and the rate on our mortgage is so big, no one's moving. And therefore, even though there's not much demand because prices are high, selection's low, and rates are high, prices keep rising because supply is even less than demand. A very unusual situation, causing homeowners to increase their home equity. So even if they lose their job, they'll still have home equity. They're not going to walk out of their house and mail the keys back. They'll take care of the house, have the house sold, and move on and get a nice check. Now, this lack of demand, essentially, and lack of supply combined do a number on existing home sales. That's the problem we face in the housing industry in particular. And this is very important to keep in mind. I talked earlier about the recession not lasting long, 7, 8, 9 months, not having a huge impact on the economy. We talked about the duration of the recession being not that long, not that deep, not that long. But moreover, the housing market has already experienced a recession because existing home sales fell from here, well over 6 million for a long time, down to under 4. That's the definition of a recession. And the existing housing markets already felt it. And now, I think whatever happens in 24, whether there's a mild recession or a weak economic growth and no recession, interest rates fall either way because inflation's falling, in the good case of no recession. And the recession rates will fall because there's a recession. And that reduction in interest rates will drive demand for housing and encourage people who have low mortgage rate mortgages to sell their house because they can now get another house with a rate that's higher, but not that much higher. If you look historically, when you get below 4 million, like we have been the last couple of months, it doesn't last long. Back in 94, 95, when we avoided a recession nationally because of the tech boom we talked about earlier, 64, 84, 94 being the lucky years when we had higher rates but no recession. Here we had home sales fall to 3.5 million, but within a year it was back up to 4. Here's the housing bust of 08, 09. Barely fell below 4 million, maybe for 6 or 8 months, and recovered. The only reason it fell drastically below 4 million here is because the government incentivized first-time home buyers not once, but twice, pulling demand from the future into the present. And when those incentives ended, housing demand collapsed. Existing home sales, home buying demand for 6 or 8 months, and it came back above 4. Look here, the worst of COVID, it went down quickly from 5.5 million to 4, but not below 4. Then Powell begins to raise rates quickly, and it falls to 4, but not below. Okay, now, finally, when in September and October rates ended up peaking out in the end of October at about 8%, existing home sales fell to 3.73 or 3.79 million was the lowest. In the following month, it went up to 3.82 or 3.83, up by 30 or 40,000, seasonally adjusted and so on. But we're on our way up. Rates will fall through 24, a little, a lot, depends, and then we'll go up. So just as 23 went from a pretty good year, a year to a really weak year, I think 24 is somewhat of a mirror image. Either way, the last couple months of 23 will not be repeated in 24 because rates will be lower than they were in September and October of 2023. That's important. You've gone through the worst by far. You've already experienced the worst of the existing housing market recession, no doubt. Now, this is in terms of refi, mortgage purchase activity. You can see it's weak. There's no question it's weak because people don't want to get a mortgage. People with cash, and it's not a bigger percentage as you think, but it's up a little bit, right? A lot of people who need a house are still buying a house, and most of them are getting a mortgage. But you can see it's on the weak side. This is home builder sentiment. Home builder sentiment's important, remember, because there's not a lot of existing homes to sell. If you want to work and get more business selling homes, a great place to look is new home construction. Home builders were very unhappy, rates go up. Then they realize there's no inventory and they get happy and they build homes. And then the last couple of months of 23, interest rates went up in September and October and they got very unhappy again. But they're fighting back, if you will. And what you see here is interesting. This is permits, so what's going to happen in the future. Single-family permits are doing well. This is because no one's putting their existing housing market on the market to sell. Multifam here is doing poorly. Overall, the single-fam is overpowering the multifam, and total permit activity is rising. Similarly, starts, very similar story. Single-fam doing well, multifam doing poorly, and overall doing okay. Because there's no single-fam existing markets on the sale, because the homeowners currently have the golden handcuffs of super low interest rates, builders are filling the void. It's important to get to know a builder and offer to say, hey, I'm happy to be your realtor. Let me sell your homes. This is new home sales. Last couple months, they went down because rates were very high. But as rates come down, as they've already fallen from near 8 to the mid, down by a whole percentage point, this will come back. And this is important because of this. Look at the percentage of homes that are for sale that are new. Historically, way back when, before the global financial crisis, housing bust, it was 10, 12, 13, 14%, whatever. Then there was a housing bust. It fell to next when builders were barely building homes. And it ratcheted back up. And then during COVID, it went crazy because there's no existing homes to buy. The percentage of homes that are available that are new is now 25%, double its historic average. It's important to be involved in this market one way or another to the best of your ability. Now, how are builders fighting back? Builders are saying, let's lower the price of the new home. So prices were higher. This is average price and median price, and they've come down. Why have they come down? Because the size of the home has come down. So builders are saying we're going to build a smaller house, therefore it'll sell for, we can make it a lower priced house. And then on top of that, the buyer says, let's go get a 2-1 buy down, lowering the interest rate by 2 percentage points the first year and 1 percentage point the second year. The combination of a less expensive house because it's smaller with a 2-1 buy down allows these homes to be competitive with existing homes. And that's why you've got to be in this market to some extent. Now, I want to sort of close this section of my talk reiterating the fact that if we have a recession, it's going to be mild, short, and very different than the 08-09 recession that we remember. First, demographics. Back then we were here, weak demographics. Number of people, 4 million people, 3.5 million, 3 million, was low. Youngsters buying a home. Now it's very, very high. The demand for housing is strong. 13, 14 years ago, we were overbuilt by 1 million, 1.5 million homes nationally. Now we're underbuilt by 3 or 4 million homes. 13 or 14 or 15 years ago, home prices were high and rents were low. Now, home prices are high and rents are pretty high too. You can't just change how you're living, renting versus buying or vice versa, to save money. Not going to work. On top of that, no one to build homes. Unemployment in construction is remarkably low. 13, 14, 15 years ago, had we been able to build homes, and had there been demand by builders to build homes, we could have done it. Now we can't. And we have the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, the green energy, battery EVs, and so on, and the CHIPS bill, building fabrication plants for semiconductors, all needing construction workers. There aren't enough construction workers to fulfill all the demand for construction activity out there. We're not going to be building homes, left, right, and center. Moreover, 13, 14, 15 years ago, there was a housing bubble. This was put up by the Mortgage Bankers Association. Now there's no bubble. 15 years ago, people getting 110% mortgages. Now they're putting down 12, 13%. As a result, 13, 14 years ago, people didn't have home equity. Now they do. So even if we have a recession, unemployment, as I mentioned earlier, rose by 5.5 percentage points. Now it might rise by 2. This is a worldly different recession, a world of a different recession than it was back in 2009. Don't reflexively think of a recession and think back to 08-09. It's very unhelpful to do it. Moreover, who are buying houses? What are the household characteristics? Look at the FICO scores of current buyers. They've been very high. Contrast that with what was going on up through 08, where the percentage of people buying houses was generally well below the highest FICO bucket of 760. So the buyers now, if they keep their jobs and will have very limited rise in unemployment, this is not the recession of 08-09. Please remember that. Moreover, the cost of building general construction, not residence in particular, but all construction, is up about 40% since COVID began. As a result, that even if someone loses their home at a low-end home, an entry-level home, it'll be snapped up very fast because the builders aren't building entry-level homes because the costs are so high. So there's a crying demand for entry-level homes. And they have home equity. Even if they lose their home, they have home equity. They'll take care of the house and so on. It's not like 08-09. This is renovation, alteration, repair, and you can see it's going to weaken because there's not a lot of home sales going on. And this is to give you a clue of how expensive homes are. A double wide is $150,000 to buy. Pre-COVID, $110,000. And if you want a well, and a septic system and some land, probably $100,000 bucks. So you're paying $250,000 for essentially the lowest level house you can get. That's expensive, and in Colorado, more, in the West in general, certain parts of the country less, parts more, but you get the idea. Last but not least for this section, single-fam home construction. During COVID, builders couldn't get parts to finish their house and get a C of O. So the number of homes being built increased dramatically, but now home builders are finishing those houses and they're being released in the market. By contrast, in the multifam market, the number of homes being built went way up when COVID started, and it's barely begin to come down. This will cause rents to fall a little bit, vacancy rates to go up. High rates are causing cap rates to be high. This is a market that's not going to be doing so well in the near future. Longer term, it'll be fine, but in the short term, not so much. Let's close out by looking at how things are going nationally, if you will. I'm going to show you a couple different trends. First trend is population growth. I just put two arrows over two Western states that are here. Historically speaking, the West was growing quite rapidly. There were a number of states, Arizona, Colorado, for example, that grew quickly. They're not. The population of the U.S., fastest population growth is taking place in the South, the West, or the South, Texas, you can define, the South, D.C. is really small, and the South. The South is where people are generally moving, with some to the West. If you take a map of the U.S., and you draw a line across the U.S. from Washington, say, to San Francisco, along Interstate I-70, people are moving below the line. That's where they're going. This is a long-term general trend. People moving to warmer climates, better climates, lower taxes, and so on. This is a slide of the overall economic conditions of the country. You can see a year ago, we have the most recent data for November 23, so I'm comparing it to November 22 to give us a year-over-year comparison. This is what was going on a year ago. The more turquoise the color, the better. Green is okay, turquoise is great. So terrific, good, you get the idea. I'm in Denver right now, so I have a line over Colorado. You get the idea. What's happened in the intervening year? Things have weakened. What states are the strongest now? The South, Texas, and sort of the West in general, the exception of Montana, right? Alaska. Here, it's a little bit weaker. Again, if we draw that line from Washington, D.C. here to San Francisco over there, that line, it's a curved line, obviously, going something like that. That's where people are generally moving. Keep this in mind going forward. There are exceptional states elsewhere and so on and so forth, but the census data keeps coming out telling us states like New York and Illinois, Wisconsin, Illinois, they're struggling a little bit. So you can't change your weather, you can't change. Your job, if you're in these states, is to enjoy the population growth. And if you're not in those states, you're in the Northeast or the Midwest, is to improve your skills. Be better at what you do. Be a better realtor, learn some new areas of realty, right? Maybe get a license in a neighboring state, whatever it is. That's your job. Don't sit here and say, oh, I'm here. No, take advantage of the opportunities that are there. Build up your human capital, build up your skill sets, build up your contacts, and improve your business. There's no reason just take what's happening. We are all, as I say, free agents, right? Let's wrap it up. 2024 is unlikely to be as good as 23. GDP is likely to be a good deal slower. If GDP in 23 was, say, 2.3 or 2.4%, next year it'll be 1.4%. That's my expectation. The Fed has stopped raising rates. They may talk about raising rates. It's just talk. That's all it is. Job growth will likely slow from where it is now in the upper 100s. How much will it fall? Does it fall to 150? Fine. 125? Okay. 100? Bearable. Below 100, unemployment starts to rise, and we got a bit of a problem on our hands. Inflation will keep falling. The key thing, how fast will it fall? If it falls quickly, the Fed can then lower rates more quickly, and that's better for the economy. Hopefully without a recession coming. But prepare for the possibility or likelihood of a mild recession. But again, if you're in realty, it doesn't really matter because you've already seen home sales fall from 6.5 million roughly in 2021, early 22 to under 4 million. The definition, in my mind, of a recession. Last but not least, watch inflation. It's number one, but I showed you 5 measures of inflation. all of them coming down. It will continue to fall. The key question is the speed, how much faster, how much more it falls, and how quickly it falls. And watch unemployment. If it hits above 4%, the recession's coming. Last but not least, and as Lane mentioned in his introduction, I put out 70 words on the economy every day. No graphs, no ads, no charts, no links, no photos. The easiest way to get it is to take out your phone and text the word bow tie as it appears here. 6 letters, no hyphen, no space, to the 5-digit number 66866. You'll be prompted for an email address, bowtie, to 66866, and you'll hear from me every day for the rest of your life. Lane, it's been a real pleasure being here.
Elliot, thank you. Let me shake your hand. I appreciate you breaking it down for us and really making it digestible for those of us who don't think about this all the time. So we appreciate your time today, and we appreciate all of you for watching. If you were invited to this program, perhaps given a link by a Coldwell Banker agent, please reach out to them if you have any additional questions. I also want to thank our great technical team here in Denver for making all of this possible. We appreciate your efforts. That's going to do it from us, for us. Thanks for watching. See you next time.